In San Jose, California, stands one of the largest and bizarre private residences in the United States, known as the Winchester Mystery House. There is a house in San Jose, California, that has been telling the wrong story for over 100 years. Millions of people have walked through its doors, listened to guides describe staircases that climb into ceilings and doors that open onto blank walls, and left convinced they had witnessed the physical evidence of a broken mind. The house has been called a monument to madness, a labyrinth built by a woman so consumed by guilt and supernatural terror that she could not stop building, even in her sleep. It has inspired Hollywood films, countless ghost tours, and an entire industry built on the idea that grief can drive a brilliant person completely insane. There is only one significant problem with all of that. Almost none of it is true. What researchers have actually found inside those walls over the past decade is something far more interesting than any ghost story, and far more revealing about how history chooses to remember certain kinds of people. The first thing you need to understand is what kind of woman Sarah Winchester actually was, because the version sold to tourists for a century bears almost no resemblance to the person documented in historical records. Sarah Lockwood Pardee was born on June 4, 1839, in New Haven, Connecticut, into a household that was genuinely unusual for its era. Her father Leonard held regular gatherings with abolitionists and freethinkers, and the family openly discussed suffrage, animal rights, and the abolition of slavery at a time when those were considered radical positions. Sarah grew up in an environment where independent thinking was not just tolerated but actively cultivated. By the age of 12, she was fluent in Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian. She studied mathematics, science, and Shakespeare at an institution directly affiliated with Yale College at a time when most women were not permitted anywhere near a university. A contemporary named Merle H. Gray wrote something about Sarah that historians largely ignored for over a century. Gray described her as a musician with a genius for composition, a remarkable businesswoman, a French scholar, a philanthropist whose giving alone would have made her a national figure if it had been publicly known, and, most critically, a full-fledged architect familiar with the building traditions of multiple countries. That is the woman who built the Winchester Mystery House. Not a grieving widow who lost her grasp on reality. A formally educated, multilingual architectural mind who happened to be a woman in the Victorian era, which meant the world was never going to give her credit for what she actually built. Her move to California around 1884 and her eventual purchase of a farmhouse on 45 acres in San Jose in 1886 was not an escape from supernatural forces. Her physicians had recommended the California climate for her worsening rheumatoid arthritis. It was a medical decision followed by a real estate investment in a growing region. What she proceeded to build on that property over the next 36 years was one of the most technically sophisticated private construction projects in California history, and the mythology that surrounds it was not created by Sarah Winchester. It was created by people who had never met her, 7 months after she died. Sarah died on September 5, 1922. When appraisers came to evaluate the property, they considered the earthquake-damaged structure essentially worthless as real estate. In April of 1923, a man named John Brown, a roller coaster designer, and his wife Mamie signed a lease on the property. Mamie Brown became the first tour guide. The tourist operation opened on June 30, 1923, with more than 10,000 visitors arriving on the first weekend alone. Mamie Brown stood at the front of every tour group and told stories about Sarah Winchester's deteriorating mental state, her supernatural obsessions, and her desperate attempts to confuse the spirits of the dead. She invented these stories. She had never met Sarah Winchester and had no access to any document, letter, or testimony that supported what she was telling visitors. The people who had actually known Sarah were horrified. Anderson became the general manager of the Winchester Mystery House in 2015, and on one of his first days on the job, he noticed something that hundreds of thousands of visitors before him had completely missed. Too many doors were locked. Over the next 2 years, his preservation team opened 40 previously sealed or forgotten spaces throughout the house. Behind those locked doors were rooms with jewel-colored wallpaper still vibrant after a century of isolation, stained glass windows mounted at unusual heights, and secret balconies that no tour guide had ever described to any visitor. Magnuson told Atlas Obscura directly that there were very possibly things his team had not yet discovered, simply because no blueprints for the structure have ever been found. The single most dramatic discovery came in 2016 when the preservation team found a sealed attic space that had been completely closed off since Sarah Winchester's death in September of 1922. They named it the Daisy Room, after the pattern of daisy flowers pressed into the glass of its windows. What they found inside that room stopped the team completely. Sitting in the sealed attic were a pump organ, a Victorian couch, a dress form, a sewing machine, and several paintings, all arranged as if someone had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. The room had been untouched for nearly a century. That discovery pushed the official room count of the house to 161. And it raised a question that no one in 100 years of tourism and mythology had ever seriously attempted to answer. If this house was genuinely the product of a disturbed mind building randomly to confuse supernatural forces, then why did every sealed room contain evidence of careful, deliberate purpose? Why was every hidden space designed with clear intention? The answer that emerges when you look at the Winchester Mystery House as an engineering problem rather than a ghost story is remarkable. The innovations Sarah built into her home were decades ahead of their time. The house featured indoor plumbing with both hot and cold running water and a working hot water shower at a period when most wealthy households considered indoor plumbing a luxury. That framing matters enormously. A man who supervised a construction project of this complexity for 36 years while incorporating cutting-edge technology would have been celebrated as a visionary engineer. Sarah Winchester was dismissed as insane. The most significant engineering achievement in the entire house has nothing to do with elevators or intercom systems. It has to do with earthquakes. On April 18, 1906, one of the most devastating earthquakes in American history struck the San Francisco Bay Area at an estimated magnitude of 7.9. Before that morning, the Winchester House stood 7 stories tall. The quake destroyed the upper floors, the central tower, and several chimneys. But the core of the structure survived. It survived because Sarah Winchester had built it with what engineers would later recognize as a compensated foundation, a construction approach in which the structure is not rigidly attached to its brick base, allowing the building to shift and absorb seismic energy rather than fracture under it. This is the same fundamental principle that underlies modern earthquake-resistant construction. Sarah Winchester applied it to a private residence in the 1880s, decades before earthquake engineering existed as a formal discipline. The house survived the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake as well. The same structure, the same foundation, still standing after more than 130 years of California tremors. The so-called seance room, the small blue-walled chamber that tour guides have described for over a century as the center of Sarah's supernatural rituals, is perhaps the clearest example of how completely the mythology departed from reality. The story told to visitors involves a bell tower ringing at midnight to summon spirits, Sarah entering the room and remaining until 2 in the morning to receive building instructions from the dead, and architectural features designed specifically to confuse ghosts. Every element of this story is false. Ignacio spent years tracking down the origin of the seance room mythology and found that there are no mentions of a seance room anywhere in any document written before a 1928 magazine article published 6 years after Sarah died. The room itself, according to historical research, was actually the private office of Sarah's head gardener, a Japanese man named Tommy Nishihara. Local historian Ralph Rambo documented the room being used as a bedroom at various times by her foreman, her chauffeur, and her head gardener and his wife. Henrietta Sebers, who was Sarah Winchester's personal companion and spent more time in her company than almost anyone else, stated directly that Winchester had no superstitious beliefs of any kind. The 13 hooks in the cabinet that tour guides describe as a symbol of Sarah's supernatural obsessions were, according to Ignacio, installed by the tourist operation around 2008, nearly a century after Sarah died. A woman who was described to tour guests for a century as haunted by guilt over the lives her family's weapons had taken actually spent over $1 million saving the lives of people dying from the same disease that killed her husband. She was also one of the first major donors to the organization that launched what would become the Save the Redwoods campaign in California. She employed hundreds of workers from American, Dutch, Italian, Irish, Chinese, and Japanese backgrounds, paying them $3 per day at a time when the standard daily wage for construction laborers was $1. She purchased homes for longtime employees, named several of them in her will, and former workers named their children after her. Bruce Spoon, a San Jose State University historian who wrote his master's thesis on Sarah Winchester in 1951 and interviewed former employees and contractors who had actually worked on the house, concluded that Sarah had two primary motivations for her continuous construction. She genuinely enjoyed architecture as a creative outlet, and she wanted to provide sustained employment to workers who needed income during the economic downturns of the late Victorian era. The Mill Valley Record published an editorial in 1922 that described her as a quiet woman who went quietly out of life, leaving a fortune destined entirely for philanthropy. That quietness, that deliberate absence from public attention, was what made her an easy target. She moved through the world with the kind of intentional privacy that the Victorian era expected from wealthy women, and that privacy made her an open canvas onto which the carnival workers who arrived 7 months after her death could paint whatever story would sell the most tickets. The academic community has spent the last 15 years systematically dismantling the mythology. Christine R. Junker, in a peer-reviewed paper published in the journal Home Cultures in 2015, argued that the mythology around the house reveals a great deal about the anxieties of an era regarding class, gender, and domesticity, and that it obscures the genuinely interesting aspects of the architectural project. The University of Wyoming Firearms Research Center published a direct reassessment of Sarah's legacy in October of 2023, stating that her real story is that of a brilliant, charitable woman whose life was marred by tragedy and forever tarnished by gossip and tabloid invention. Mary Jo Ignafo, whose biography remains the most thorough historical examination of Sarah Winchester ever published, summed up her century of misrepresentation simply: Sarah Winchester had a bum rap. And in a 2025 updated edition of her book, Ignafo added that her hope is that audiences will reconsider how quickly we label someone as crazy or subversive. Walter Magnuson and his team are still opening locked spaces. Still finding rooms that should not exist according to any logical reading of the tourist mythology. Still discovering evidence of a mind that was building with purpose rather than panic. With no blueprints and over 160 confirmed rooms, there are very possibly spaces inside that structure that no living person has yet seen. And somewhere in those walls, in the acoustic engineering of the domed witch's cap room, in the stained glass windows that quote Shakespeare, in the earthquake-resistant foundation that has been absorbing California's tremors for over 130 years, the real story of Sarah Winchester has been waiting. Not the ghost story. Not the mad widow. The story of a 4'10" woman who spoke 4 languages, built a hospital that still operates at Yale, employed hundreds of workers at wages considered remarkable for the era, engineered structures that have outlasted a century of seismic activity, and did almost all of it quietly, anonymously, in ways that the world was never supposed to notice. The real mystery of the Winchester Mystery House was never what was inside the walls. The real mystery was why it took more than 100 years for anyone to seriously look.